Bienvenidas, mis amigas. It's time to talk about some essential Juliet core, and by that I mean Resident Evil 4. It's basically the perfect video game. It's got a dumbass saying lines in response to all the game's events, but like in a good way rather than the bad way that Ethan Winters does it. It's got body horror. It's got goofy hammer horror stuff. It's also quite simply one of the most fun games ever made. I could gush about Resident Evil 4 for an extremely long time, and some of that will probably seep into this video, but that's not my primary focus here. I'm Juliet Necro, your favorite dorky goth girl. Since I talked about propaganda in my last video, it got me thinking about Resident Evil 4 again. In the overall narrative presented from Resident Evil 1 through 5, I would argue that 4 is the least important piece in that story. The only returning characters are Leon, Ada, and Wesker is only mentioned outside of the extra Ada campaign. It's sort of a strange little cul-de-sac with a very different tone from its older sisters. I think part of the reason this happened is because of a tonal shift that occurred in the popular culture after 9/11. The previous Resident Evil games, aside from spin-offs like the Outbreak games and Dead Aim, were released or would have still been in development at the time. Resident Evil 4 is profoundly post-9/11, and we're about to spend quite a while discussing why. Every video game is either about being trans or about 9/11, and Resident Evil 4 manages to thread the needle by being about both. Don't believe me? I'll throw the transsexual reading on the screen for 5 seconds. Read 'em and weep, idiot. Underneath the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon, and the fields of central Pennsylvania were hidden veins of Hitler particles. When the attack occurred, those Hitler particles were aerosolized, and many in America inhaled them very, very deeply. Soon they were carried on the winds to other parts of the world, in addition to being spread by American power both soft and hard. Despite being produced in Japan, Resident Evil 4 is maximally George W. Bush brain. I'll be referring to him as W for the remainder of this video, though, because I'm also from Texas. I was only 5 years old in September of 2001. I have memories that far back. I'm reasonably certain that my first memory is my brother receiving a Super Nintendo for his 6th birthday when I was 2. Unlike a lot of my older peers, though, I only have vague memories of 9/11. All I remember is my mother crying and trying to explain it to me in terms a 5-year-old would understand. Without a doubt, though, I remember a bit of what it was like to live in America during W's first term, when much of the country was swept up in war fever. It is a testament to how pervasive the hawkish attitude was that I literally only learned as an adult that there were protests early on in the War on Terror, especially against the invasion of Iraq. In 2002, Toby Keith released a song called Brought to You Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, The Angry American. It's a crass and jingoistic anthem in favor of the war in Afghanistan. A critical line to understanding the mentality is this one. Now this nation I love has fallen under attack. A mighty sucker punch came flying in from somewhere in the back. That was how a lot of Americans viewed and still view 9/11, as a sucker punch that we could never have seen coming. We know for a fact that this is not true. You can literally go and read a declassified US government document titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in US that stated August 6, 2001. It's only 2 pages. Read it. I'll wait. In reality, of course, the 9/11 attacks happened in retaliation for American foreign policy in the Middle East. I'm not saying it's good that they happened, but it didn't happen for no reason like I was told as a child. When I was a little older, all that patriotism was still in full effect. I think in my elementary school music class we sang the Star-Spangled Banner more than just about any other song. I remember military flyovers at sporting events, and constant calls to support the troops, whatever that meant. I bore witness many times to adults practically kowtowing to uniformed soldiers and telling them thank you for your service. I remember when I was a little bit older in elementary school, I asked the adults in my life why the terrorists had attacked the United States, why we were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan now. At least one member of my family, I'm no longer precisely sure who, used the phrasing, "they hate us for our freedom." Now this is not a political goal that any real person actually has, but W said much the same thing to a joint session of Congress on September 20th of 2001. Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what we see right here in this chamber. A democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms. Our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. Like I said before, it has to do with the US's foreign policy decisions. 9/11 was a bad thing to do, but it happened for reasons. So what does all this have to do with Resident Evil 4? A lot, actually. Alright, so it's still a short video, but I want to do an intermission because it's been frickin' ages since I've done one. Originally, this video was going to be a bit different in scope, because I was going to also play the remake for it and compare notes on how and compare notes on how that game treats the subjects compared to the original. But I bought it, and it ran at like 3 frames per second on my laptop, and I was like, alright, fuck this. I'm just refunding it. So I did, which I don't regret, really. Maybe this is sour grapes, but I don't really see the point in remaking Resident Evil 4. I mean, like, I feel like a lot of the reason they remade 2 and 3 is to sort of bring them in line with Resident Evil 4 in terms of controls. So it just feels like they're just making it with nicer graphics. Obviously, I know the reason they did it so they can sell it at a high price point again, but you know what I mean. I thought maybe I could just, like, watch the cutscenes on YouTube and, like, borrow footage from somebody else, but I don't really want to do that. I never really want to talk about a game on this channel that I haven't actually played. So, I won't, quite simply. But anyway, your game for today is Riichi Mahjong. So you might have thought this was only video games, which is very naive and silly of you. But a couple weeks ago, my friends taught me to play Mahjong, and I've kind of gotten addicted to it. It was very auspicious that I was actually in the middle of Yakuza Kiwami 2 at the time. So, in addition to playing against my friends on Mahjong Soul, I also played a bunch of it in Yakuza Kiwami. And apparently I got pretty decent, because I was beating my friends last time we played. But give it a try, it's fun, I promise. And your movie for today is Beach of the War Gods. So, Beach of the War Gods is a Jimmy Wang Yu production. If you know about him, then you probably are already excited. But it's basically like a very wuxia, very Jimmy Wang Yu take on the story of the Seven Samurai, right? It's about, like, a bunch of cool guys defending a place from marauding invaders. But it's, you know, like I said, it's a twist on that same premise, and it's very good. The action's fantastic. But, like, really, I recommend any Jimmy Wang Yu movie, because all the ones that I've seen were amazing. So, give that a watch. And you know what, while you're at it, give The Man from Hong Kong and The Chinese Boxer a watch as well. All that being said, back to the video. The main villain of Resident Evil 4 is a cult leader called Osman Sadler, whose goal is to take control of the United States by using the president's daughter, Ashley, to infect the nation's leaders with the Plagas parasite. Why does he want to do this? Unclear. We know he basically wants world domination, and that he really hates Americans. He's constantly making digs at Leon for being an American. He's a perfect Bush-era villain in that he has no ideology aside from being evil, hating America, and desiring power. I mean, I also hate America and desire power, but I actually do so for ideological reasons. I would still gladly wear his sick-ass Palpatine robes, though. Somebody with money should pay for me to get Sith robes, and also a Char Aznable cosplay, and also a Prosper Mercury cosplay. If you return to that sucker punch theory of 9/11, then Sadler makes perfect sense. He seems to hate America just because it exists. He's the exact kind of villain that the first Bush term imagined. Someone who's simply evil for the sake of it and hates America for its freedom, rather than for America's many unanswered-for crimes and interferences on the world stage. Not only that, but he's not using conventional weapons to do it either, which was also a huge Bush-era fixation. During the first Bush term, the government and their consent-manufacturing lackeys in the media were obsessed with the idea of unconventional weapons in the hands of the enemies of the United States. In his State of the Union address in 2002, W accused 3 states, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, of attempting to acquire weapons of mass destruction. States like these, and their terrorist allies, constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. Old W turned out to be only 1 for 3 on that one. Not much of a Texas sharpshooter, eh? I've always thought the term axis of evil was funny, since it implies that those 3 states were working together. Iran and Iraq fought a horrific war against each other from 1980 to 1988, which the United States supported Iraq in, by the way. In that war, Iraq deployed chemical weapons against Iran, and Iran has had a policy of non-proliferation of such weapons ever since. We believe that besides nuclear weapons, other types of weapons of mass destruction such as chemical and biological weapons also pose a threat to humanity. The Iranian nation, which is itself a victim of chemical weapons, feels more than any other nation the danger that is caused by the production and stockpiling of such weapons, and is prepared to make use of all of its facilities to counter such threats. As we just saw, Iraq did use chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War, but by the new millennium they didn't have them anymore. That didn't stop the Bush administration and the US news media from breathlessly repeating the claim that Iraq had a program creating weapons of mass destruction. At no point before, during, or after the war was there any solid evidence of this, but oh well. The United States invaded anyway. In 2005, the United States gave up looking for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and yet we occupied the country for another 6 years afterward. Why is that? Naturally, it's because the United States loves nothing more than imperialism. And not only that, they want to pretend that they're the good guys for doing imperialism. First, it was creating an empire of liberty across the North American continent. Then it was using the liberation of Cuba and the freak explosion of the USS Maine as a pretense to steal most of Spain's maritime empire. Then it was making the world safe for democracy by backing Britain and France, both of which had massive colonial empires, and Russia, an autocracy that didn't even pretend to be democratic. For most of the 20th century, the United States embarked on brutal imperialist crusades and overthrew democratic government in the name of containing communism. The War on Terror was very much in line with all of that. If our only goal was really to stop terrorism and not to use it as a pretense for imperialism, why did the United States invade Afghanistan when the Taliban offered to give up Osama bin Laden? For fuck's sake, the Taliban offered to give up bin Laden before 9/11, in exchange for recognition of their government, and again afterward in exchange for the end of airstrikes in the country. But bin Laden being there was a convenient excuse for invasion and regime change, so invade and change regimes the United States did. We spent 20 years, from when I was 5 until I was 25, occupying Afghanistan, and the regime flipped back as soon as the United States departed. If you look at the results, we spent 20 years, many lives, and billions of dollars to accomplish nothing. In the end, we didn't even find bin Laden in Afghanistan. It only makes sense if you view it as imperialism. Sadler is in line with all of this. He makes the perfect villain for a Bush-era video game, because if he were real, he'd be the one time that the president's war on terror rhetoric was correct. He's motivated by hatred of the United States rather than any coherent ideology, and he's a non-state actor who has access to unconventional weapons. If he existed, the United States would invade so fucking hard, but they would send the whole military instead of one beautiful stone butch he-him lesbian Secret Service agent. Nowadays, the United States seems to be dusting off the very same rhetoric that led to the invasion of Iraq, caterwauling about the Iranian government having nuclear weapons. I'm recording this video 2 days after my 29th birthday, and I'm realizing now that I'm old enough to see Marx proven right. That all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. The first is tragedy, the second is farce. Well, that may be true, but it still feels pretty damn tragic right now. How did Resident Evil 4 wind up parroting such rhetoric? Well, it simply evolved with the times. I love the PS1 Resident Evil trilogy, but they are very of their time for the mid to late 90s. The 90s were the so-called end of history, so the pervasive feeling at the time was, is this it? Neoliberalism forever? A lot of fiction from the time clumsily critiqued capitalism without naming it as such. Prominent examples being movies like The Matrix, Fight Club, Office Space, and Hackers. Afterward is where the series became much more of a soap opera about Wesker, the Umbrella execs, and the Raccoon City survivors, starting in games like Zero and Code Veronica, but decidedly accelerating in 4, which soaks up American propaganda like a sponge. How appropriate for a soap opera. It is pretty common for people to critique the next game, Resident Evil 5, for being horrifically racist. It is 1000% true that that game is racist, and much worse about imperialist ideas than 4 is. But it didn't come from nowhere. With the exception of basically only Luis, the people of Spain aren't presented very positively in Resident Evil 4. They speak Spanish, but it isn't presented with subtitles, alienating them from the player unless the player is a Spanish speaker. Now my Spanish is still A1 level, but I understood most of what they said on this playthrough. It amounts to very simple barks. Treating foreigners as NPCs, not just in the video game sense, but the slang sense, started here and got much worse in the next game. Building on what I talked about last month in that video on Quake mods and Calls of Duty, whether Resident Evil 4 is propaganda on purpose or not doesn't really matter. It just takes some things for granted. The idea that the United States has the right to violate other nations' sovereignty to go after terrorists, and that those terrorists have no ideology of their own. Once more, I fucking love Resident Evil 4. However, I stick to my guns and never take in any work of art without some degree of criticism, and neither should you. It's unfortunately a perfectly crystallized time capsule of the dominant mindset circa 2005. All I can say is I'm lucky to have been too young to realize what was going on then. Can we please move past the damn war on terror already? And more importantly, can we remember that video games are for women?